A famous judge, known for his rigidity and bias, harshly punished a black man simply for being late. When the man's identity was revealed, the judge couldn't hide his shock and confusion. What seemed like a simple case turned into a revelation of deep flaws and prejudice within the legal system. What would you do when faced with such an abuse of power? Leave a comment about where you're watching this story and share your thoughts. Let's raise our voices for justice together. The clock on the dashboard displayed 8:42 a.m. when Darius Carter, the federal prosecutor, parked his car in the lot outside the Magnolia City Court. The bright morning sun cast long shadows of trees across the asphalt, but Darius couldn't relax. He hated being late, something his job, based on discipline and preparation, rarely allowed. Today, nothing was going according to plan. The issue at hand seemed simple: an objection to a real estate tax error involving the house his grandmother had left him. However, that house was more than just property. It was the heart of his childhood, where he learned right from wrong under the strict yet loving guidance of his grandmother. It had once been the site of community meetings she organized to fight social injustice in the neighborhood. For Darius, protecting this house was not just a legal obligation, but also a way of honoring his grandmother's legacy. Darius looked every bit the experienced prosecutor he was. But this morning, nothing was going smoothly. An urgent call from his team about a human trafficking case had delayed him. He couldn't ignore the pressing matter, needing to review important documents before rushing to Magnolia Court, cutting his travel time dangerously close. As he stepped up the courthouse stairs, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from a colleague appeared on the screen. "Be careful with Judge Irving Morrow. He's known for being tough, especially against black people." Darius sighed, slipping the phone into his briefcase. He wasn't too worried. Truth had always been his greatest weapon, and he came fully prepared. But the warning lingered in his mind, making the morning air feel heavier. He entered the cool hallway of Magnolia Court. Unlike the federal courts he was used to, this one had an old, somewhat dreary feel. The pale yellow walls, worn-out chairs, and the lingering smell of old paper and leftover coffee highlighted the fatigue of a place dealing with everyday minor cases. Darius checked the time. 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes to find his courtroom. His grandmother's house was waiting for him to protect it, but the challenges ahead might be much greater than he had anticipated. Darius stepped into courtroom 204, the old wooden door creaking softly as he pushed it open. The room's atmosphere made the passage of time feel almost tangible. The pale yellow walls faded with age, the rows of benches worn smooth from the years of use, and the dim light from the fluorescent bulbs above. The air, though unspoken, carried a sense of both harshness and coldness. As Darius's gaze swept across the room, he immediately recognized Judge Irving Morrow. Tall, thin, with neatly combed silver hair, Morrow sat high on the bench, like a god passing judgment on the fates below. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone commanded silence in the room. Morrow had once been an idealistic judge. In the early years of his career, he bravely fought against a corruption network in the local political system. However, his efforts not only failed but also made him a target of attacks, isolating him from colleagues and the powerful elites. Those years wore down his belief in justice. Instead, he turned to rigid discipline and absolute control as a way to protect himself from further harm. Now, the fire of Morrow's passion or fairness was gone. In its place were cold, cautious eyes tinged with bitterness. When he saw Darius walk in, his gaze flickered with a hint of irritation, an undercurrent of prejudice mixed with a fixation on power. Darius was not the first person Morrow felt he needed to teach a lesson. In Morrow's world, people like Darius, young, confident, and especially black, were often seen as those who failed to respect the rules. A soft throat clearing from the court clerk signaled that the hearing was about to begin. Irving Morrow quickly flipped through the documents in front of him. His movements were efficient but carried an unmistakable air of indifference. For Morrow, the cases in this city court were nothing more than routine procedures, places where he could impose his authority without anyone daring to challenge him. Darius sat in a row of seats at the back, his eyes carefully observing every gesture of the judge. It didn't take long for him to realize that Morrow was not just rigid, but had been shaped by past failures into a symbol of injustice disguised under the guise of order. When Judge Morrow finally looked up again, his eyes landed on Darius. The look was a silent warning, but Darius only met it with calm. He knew that the real battle had just begun. The sharp strike of Judge Irving Morrow's gavel echoed through the courtroom, pulling the entire room back into silence. He cleared his throat, scanning the list of cases before stopping at the name Darius Carter. "Carter! Darius!" he called, his dry voice ringing out like an order. Darius stood up, walking confidently but calmly up to the bench. He placed his briefcase on the table, adjusted his tie, and looked directly at Judge Morrow. But as soon as he opened his mouth to greet the judge, Morrow cut him off. "You're late," Morrow said, his tone icy. His gaze pierced through Darius, full of authority and reprimand. "Your Honor," Darius replied, maintaining a composed voice, "I sincerely apologize. I had to handle an urgent matter involving a federal human trafficking case. I hope you understand that. There is no excuse for disrespecting the court's time." Morrow interrupted sharply, his voice like a blade cutting through the air. "Rules are rules. Your tardiness wastes not only my time, but also the time of everyone else in this room." The courtroom fell silent. A few people glanced at Darius with looks of sympathy. Meanwhile, Court Clerk Ellie Sherman, who had become accustomed to Morrow's unjust decisions, squinted in displeasure but remained silent, her hands resting lightly on her keyboard. Across the room, Judge Florence Hatcher sat quietly. As Morrow's longtime colleague, she understood the harshness of his rulings. Florence watched the scene, unable to ignore the injustice, but she knew any protest from her would only make her the next target of Morrow's wrath. "You are fined $750 for contempt of court," Morrow declared, his tone final, as if there was nothing more to discuss. Darius took a deep breath, holding back the anger rising within him. He stared directly into Morrow's eyes, trying to stay calm. "Your Honor, I do not intend to disrespect the court. I just wish to explain my circumstances. No excuses are accepted here, Carter. Rules are rules. Learn to follow them or leave this profession." Morrow's words carried a veiled insult, as though deliberately aiming to attack Darius's self-respect. The excessive fine and Morrow's harsh words made the atmosphere in the room stifling. A few people lowered their heads, avoiding looking at Darius, while others, like Court Clerk Ellie Sherman, could only remain silent in the face of their helplessness. As Darius returned to his seat, he overheard some murmurs from the gallery. An elderly man whispered to his companion, "He never punishes white people like this. It's so unfair." But those words were quickly swallowed by silence as Morrow's gaze swept across the room. Meanwhile, Judge Florence Hatcher remained motionless, her eyes cast downward as if trying to avoid confronting what had just transpired. But deep inside, she couldn't deny that what had just happened only further highlighted Morrow's bias, a truth she had witnessed too many times but had never dared to speak out against. Darius opened his briefcase, pretending to focus on his notes, But in his mind, a different plan began to form. This was no longer just about him. It was about an entire system that had long enabled people like Irving Morrow. This battle was far from over. Darius sat down, trying to steady his breath after the tense confrontation with Judge Morrow. He opened his briefcase, pretending to skim through documents related to the tax case, but his mind kept drifting back to how Morrow had treated him. The sense of injustice still lingered, but Darius didn't let his emotions overpower his rationality. He began to observe the proceedings in the courtroom more closely. Soon after, a white man entered the room, clearly in a hurry. It was evident that he was just as late as Darius, if not later. Yet there was no reprimand from Judge Morrow. Instead, Morrow simply nodded and allowed him to present his case immediately. Darius furrowed his brow, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Morrow, who flipped through papers indifferently. Next, a young woman dressed in casual clothing entered, clearly unfamiliar with the courtroom atmosphere. She, too, was late and apologized flusteredly before sitting down. Morrow gave her a dismissive glance and simply reminded her, "Be mindful of the time next time," before moving on to the next case without another word. Darius could feel the discrepancy in the way people were treated. This was no coincidence. It was part of a pattern he had heard about, but was now witnessing firsthand. His mind involuntarily drifted back to college days when a classmate, Michael Sanders, had shared his experience before Judge Morrow. Michael, also a black man, had been charged with a minor traffic violation. In the courtroom, Morrow not only fined Michael double the usual amount, but also publicly mocked his job, saying, "People like you need to learn to respect the rules." At the time, Darius had only been able to comfort his friend, but that story had always stayed with him. Now, sitting in this courtroom, everything was clearer than ever. This was not just an isolated incident of injustice, it was a systemic issue, perpetuated by the power of people like Morrow. Darius glanced briefly at Judge Florence Hatcher, who sat in the corner of the room. She remained silent, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her, but Darius couldn't help but notice the look of unease in her manner. Perhaps she saw what he saw, but for some reason she chose to remain silent. Darius gripped his pen tightly, hurriedly jotting down his observations. He knew that what was happening today couldn't be forgotten. This was not just about him. It was about an entire system that hid its injustice behind the guise of discipline and power. And Darius had made up his mind. He would not stay silent like the others. He set the pen down, his gaze no longer focused on the notes in his briefcase. The observations he had made had only strengthened his resolve. The silence of the courtroom, the rustling of papers, and the cold fluorescent lighting only added to the heavy atmosphere. It was time for him to act. As the court moved on to the next case, Darius stood up and walked to the podium again. His eyes locked onto Judge Irving Morrow, who was flipping through his case files without looking up. "Your Honor," Darius began, his voice calm yet full of weight, "I believe it would be helpful if I properly introduce myself. I am Darius Carter, a federal prosecutor from the Northern District of North Carolina. I have served in the federal judiciary for over a decade, focusing on cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." Morrow looked up, his cold blue eyes staring hard at Darius. There was a brief flicker of doubt, but he quickly masked it with a stern demeanor. "I fail to see how that is relevant to this case, Carter," he responded, his voice more rigid than usual. "Your Honor," Darius continued, unwavering, "I'm not just here to address a personal issue regarding property tax. I also cannot ignore what I witnessed this morning. The way you've handled cases here, particularly those involving late arrivals, seems inconsistent. I have to ask, Are the rules being applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? The tension in the room became palpable. Whispers began to ripple through the audience. Some eyes nervously turned to Judge Morrow, while others, including Rosa Hart, an elderly woman sitting in the front row, looked at Darius with an expression full of empathy. Her gaze seemed to say, "Finally, someone is speaking out." Morrow furrowed his brow, a rare look of discomfort crossing his face. He lightly tapped his fingers on the table, a habit that Darius quickly recognized as a sign of agitation. But he didn't reveal more. "Carter, you're risking going too far," Morrow said, his voice low and threatening. "If you want to accuse me of unfairness, I won't hesitate to increase the penalty. This is not your federal courtroom. Here, I set the rules." That threat didn't make Darius flinch. He lifted his head high, his gaze steady. "Your Honor, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply asking a question because I believe the principle of fairness should be upheld in any courtroom, whether federal or city level. What I'm asking is, are you sure that everyone in this room is being treated equally?" Morrow narrowed his eyes, his lips pressed tight. Perhaps, for the first time in years, he was confronted with such a direct challenge. He opened his mouth to speak, but just then Rosa Hart softly cleared her throat. Every eye in the room turned toward her, but she sat still, her eyes filled with meaning as they locked onto Darius, offering silent support. "Enough," Morrow finally interjected, striking his gavel hard against the bench. "I will not allow this courtroom to turn into a personal platform. Return to your seat, Carter. We are continuing with the proceedings." Darius nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Morrow's. He returned to his seat, but he didn't feel defeated. On the contrary, Morrow's fleeting discomfort and loss of control only confirmed to Darius that he had struck a nerve. A larger battle lay ahead, and Darius was ready for it. As the session adjourned, Darius left the courtroom with a composed exterior, but inside a storm of anger and determination churned. The image of Judge Irving Morrow, authoritative yet momentarily shaken when challenged, lingered in his mind. Darius knew that what he had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It was indicative of a deeper, systemic issue that needed uncovering. Back in his office at the federal courthouse, Darius began drafting a report to the prosecutor's office and judicial oversight organizations. He detailed the events of the morning, meticulously noting each act of injustice he had observed in the courtroom. However, to spark an official investigation, he needed more evidence, irrefutable data to expose the biased patterns that Morrow was enforcing. Darius thought of Ellie Sherman, Morrow's courtroom clerk, whose discomfort during the proceedings had been evident. One afternoon, he visited Ellie in her small, cluttered office. She sat behind an old wooden desk, typing on her keyboard, but stopped when she saw Darius enter. Her cautious eyes met his. "Mr. Carter," Ellie said, her voice quiet but steady, "what can I do for you?" "Ellie," Darius began, his tone gentle but firm, "I need your help. What's happening in Judge Morrow's courtroom cannot be ignored. I believe you've seen things others haven't noticed, and I think you feel, as I do, that something isn't right." Ellie stared at him, her eyes betraying her anxiety. "I'm just a clerk," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself of her insignificance. "But you're there every day," Darius replied. "You know how he handles cases, and I need the truth. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly in that room." Ellie took a deep breath, her gaze falling to her desk. A long silence passed before she opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook. "I don't know if this will help you," she said, her voice trembling, "but I've been keeping these notes for years. I couldn't stand the way he treated certain people, so I started writing it all down." Darius accepted the notebook and quickly flipped through its pages. Inside, Ellie had meticulously recorded dates, defendants' names, and clear examples of bias in Morrow's rulings. The notes were a treasure trove of information, exposing not only racial prejudice, but also Morrow's harsh treatment of vulnerable defendants. "Ellie, you don't know how important this is," Darius said, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for your courage." Ellie nodded, but the worry was still etched on her face. "Be careful, Mr. Carter," she said. "Judge Morrow isn't someone who can be easily brought down. His influence runs deeper than you think." That evening, at the federal prosecutor's office, Darius shared his plans with Sean Blake, a longtime colleague and friend. But Sean's reaction wasn't what Darius had hoped. "Darius, I understand your anger," Sean said, his voice low but firm. "But you're putting yourself in danger. Morrow isn't just a city judge. He has deep connections, and any investigation into him will draw a lot of enemies." "Sean, I can't sit back," Darius countered. "We're prosecutors. Our job is to uphold justice, not ignore wrongdoing." "True, but our job is also to survive in this system. You need to understand that sometimes fighting doesn't achieve anything but self-destruction." Sean's gaze bore into Darius, as though urging him to reconsider. But Sean's words only strengthened Darius's resolve. He stood, meeting Sean's eyes. "If this system can't exist without injustice, maybe it's not worth protecting. I'm doing this, Sean, whatever the cost." Sean sighed and shook his head. "Just remember, not everyone will stand with you." With Ellie's notebook in hand and an unshakable determination, Darius dove deeper into his research. Late into the nights, he compared the judgments in the notebook with Magnolia Court's public records, uncovering an undeniable pattern. Defendants of color, particularly black defendants, received significantly harsher penalties than white defendants for similar offenses. Ellie Sherman's notebook not only provided crucial evidence, but it also served as the key to unlocking a much larger door. Darius began gathering more data, delving deeper into the cases presided over by Judge Irving Morrow. As the pieces of the larger picture began to take shape, he realized he was facing a far greater issue, one that wasn't just about individual injustice, but a pattern of bias that had persisted for decades. But his efforts didn't stop within the confines of his office. One day, after receiving the notebook from Ellie, Darius shared his story with a friend, Nina Alvarez, a passionate law student who was always eager to fight for justice. After hearing his account, Nina offered to write about what had transpired. With her sharp writing skills and insightful perspective, Nina crafted a detailed article. She described the events in the Magnolia courtroom, from how Darius had been severely penalized for being late to the indifferent attitude Morrow showed toward others who committed similar offenses. Nina didn't shy away from criticizing the bias and injustice in the judge's handling of cases, and called on the community to speak out. The article was published on her blog and quickly gained traction. Within hours, thousands of shares and comments flooded in. People who had experienced similar injustices began to share their stories in the comments section. One person wrote, "I was fined 3 times more than someone else simply because I'm black. This isn't a coincidence." A new hashtag, Socialjustice in Magnolia, quickly became a trending topic on social media, drawing the attention of journalists and human rights organizations. As the story spread, public outrage began to boil over. Residents, many of whom had been victims in Morrow's courtroom, saw this as their chance to be heard. Lively discussions took place on social media and in small coffee shops around Magnolia. A grassroots group even organized a gathering at a park near the courthouse to share experiences and call for action. News of Nina's article quickly caught the attention of major media outlets. Journalists began reaching out to Darius for interviews to clarify the story. But he declined, focusing solely on his investigation. He knew that what mattered wasn't appearing in the media, but ensuring his evidence was strong enough to hold Morrow accountable. However, as the story gained more attention, Darius realized not everyone wanted to see justice served. One evening, as he worked late in his office, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "Give up now if you don't want to regret it. Morrow is not someone you can defeat." Darius stared at the screen, feeling the coldness in every word. But instead of discouraging him, the message only fueled his determination. If they feel the need to threaten me, he thought, it means I'm on the right track. Darius knew this battle was not just about Morrow. It was a confrontation with a system that had enabled and protected injustice for far too long. But now, he was no longer alone. The wave of public opinion had begun, and it was only growing stronger. Nina Alvarez, with her article, had sparked a movement, and Darius knew that as long as he stood firm, the truth would eventually come to light. He put the phone down, his eyes lingering on Ellie Sherman's notebook. "I won't back down," he thought to himself. The battle was far from over, but now he had an entire community backing him. The anonymous threat did not deter Darius. On the contrary, it only pushed him to accelerate his investigation. With the support of Ellie Sherman's notebook, Darius and his team at the prosecutor's office began digging deeper into the records of Judge Irving Morrow's trials over the past decade. The numbers began to speak for themselves, and they didn't lie. Black defendants were routinely handed sentences 3 times harsher than their white counterparts in similar offenses. Even requests for leniency, such as requests for payment plans, were frequently denied for black defendants, while white defendants had their requests accepted with little to no scrutiny. These findings only strengthened Darius's resolve, but he knew that the data alone wouldn't tell the full story. He needed testimony from those who had worked directly with Morrow to give weight to the investigation. In the days that followed, Darius approached Judge Florence Hatcher, a longtime colleague of Morrow's. Florence was a small but sharp woman with neatly styled silver hair. She had been present in the courtroom that day and had witnessed the entire event, yet had said nothing. Initially, Florence seemed reluctant when Darius met her in her office. "I've worked with Irving for too long," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "He has his way of doing things, and I'm not sure I can interfere." Darius leaned forward, his gaze firm. "Judge Hatcher, I understand the pressure you've been under, but what's happening here is not just a personal issue. It has become a system of injustice that people rely on to oppress the vulnerable. We cannot remain silent any longer." Florence sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze distant. She thought back to the times when Morrow had imposed his will on her, the cases where she was forced to handle matters in ways she knew were wrong. Finally, she sighed as though shedding part of the burden. "I will do what's right," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will testify." Alongside Florence's promise, Darius's team discovered an old, forgotten file in the court archives. It was a case involving a major real estate developer who had been charged with fraud. Judge Morrow had inexplicably handed down a lenient sentence, allowing the defendant to pay a token fine. What stood out was that, according to the records, the defendant's lawyers had had a private meeting with Morrow a few days before the trial. The file didn't directly accuse anyone, but notes from a former clerk suggested that a bribe had been involved. The case was quickly forgotten after the clerk abruptly resigned. This discovery made Darius realize that Morrow's injustices weren't just limited to racial bias, but also hinted at corruption. It wasn't merely a matter of professional ethics. It was a well-hidden, systemic crime. In a meeting with his investigative team, Florence Hatcher officially provided her testimony. She recounted how Morrow often imposed his will on fellow judges and forced them to comply with his decisions. He would always say we needed to maintain order, Florence said. But the truth is, his decisions were always based more on bias than the law. Florence's testimony, coupled with the evidence Darius had gathered, quickly became the foundation for an official investigation by the Judicial Oversight Committee. Darius knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time he felt that the truth was on his side. News of the investigation quickly spread through the Magnolia legal community. Morrow still maintained his outward calm, but signs of tension began to show. In court, he became increasingly irritable, trying to maintain absolute control. Darius couldn't help but notice that the powerful judge was beginning to waver. His game is coming to an end, Darius thought, his gaze steely. But he also knew that, like anyone who had confronted entrenched power, the battle ahead would not be easy. The room for the public hearing was packed. The harsh white light from the fluorescent bulbs reflected off the polished wooden tables, creating a solemn yet stifling atmosphere. The whispers grew quieter as Judge Irving Morrow entered, his usual calm demeanor still intact, but his eyes betrayed a rare sense of unease. This was no ordinary hearing. For the first time in his 3-decade-long career, it was Morrow who had to face judgment. Darius Carter sat straight-backed in the front row, reserved for prosecutors, his gaze never leaving the judge who had once unjustly sentenced him. In front of him was a thick stack of files containing irrefutable evidence, each piece pointing to one undeniable truth. Morrow's power had not been used to protect justice, but to reinforce bias and sustain injustice. Beside Darius, Florence Hatcher and Ellie Sherman sat silently, their faces reflecting determination. This was not just Darius's fight. This was the moment when the entire Magnolia legal system was placed on the scales. The room fell into a deeper silence when the chairperson of the committee declared the hearing open. Her authoritative voice rang out. Judge Irving Morrow, you are summoned today to answer questions related to your conduct and decisions in the Magnolia courtroom. This hearing aims to determine whether your actions have violated the principles of fair justice. Morrow rose, his imposing figure a remnant of the authority he once wielded. I have served in this judicial system for over 3 decades, he began, his voice slow and deliberate. I have always worked with the singular goal of maintaining order and the dignity of the law. My decisions have not always been popular, but I believe they were made with responsibility and reason. His tone carried a hint of pride, yet it could not hide the tension in his eyes. Morrow scanned the room, attempting to catch a sympathetic glance, but all he encountered were cold or scrutinizing stares. This was no longer the courtroom where he had once reigned supreme. It was a place where he had to answer for his actions. Darius stood up when granted permission to speak, his gaze briefly resting on Morrow before sweeping across the room. The air seemed to freeze. Everyone, from the Oversight Committee to the onlookers, was focused on the man holding the thick stack of files in his hand. He walked confidently to the podium, his calm demeanor radiating an undeniable authority. Honorable Committee, Darius began, his voice echoing in the stillness of the room. We are not here today to hear about Judge Morrow's years of service or the justifications for his decisions. We are here to ask one crucial question. Has the power he wielded been used to uphold justice, or has it been abused to perpetuate injustice? Darius paused, his eyes scanning each member of the committee. Today is not about an individual. Today is about how our justice system has failed the very people who need it most. He slowly opened the file, each movement adding to the tension in the room. He pulled out the first few pages and carefully placed them on the podium. Over the past 10 years, he continued, his voice becoming sharper. According to the data we've gathered, the average sentence for black defendants in Judge Morrow's courtroom is 3 times harsher than for white defendants in similar cases. He raised a chart, the numbers illustrated by brightly colored bars. Each bar seemed to pierce the veneer of Morrow's authority. Not only that, Darius added, his voice growing heavier, black defendants have been denied requests for leniency, such as payment plans at more than twice the rate of white defendants. This is no coincidence. This is a pattern of systemic bias. Darius stepped closer, his eyes alight with determination. These numbers do not lie. They are not subjective feelings or guesses. They are facts, and these facts paint a clear picture. Judge Morrow's power has not been used to protect justice. It has been used to protect prejudice. Morrow, sitting in his chair, could no longer mask the tremor in his eyes. He tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden desk, a habit Darius recognized from the early days of his own experiences in that courtroom. But this time, the sound wasn't a mark of authority. It was the sound of a man searching for an escape. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Morrow said, his voice lower now, as if struggling to hold on to some semblance of confidence. "I've always tried to do what was best to maintain order in my courtroom. If there have been mistakes, they were unintentional, not deliberate." Darius didn't let that excuse pass. "Unintentional mistakes?" he repeated, his voice sharp like a knife. "Judge Morrow, when these unintentional mistakes happen repeatedly over a decade and always target the same group of people, that's no longer a mistake. That's a system." He turned to the Oversight Committee, his voice growing stronger. "What we're talking about here isn't just numbers on paper. This is about lives that have been ruined, families that have been torn apart, and a trust in our justice system that has been shattered. Judge Morrow's decisions haven't just been rulings. They've been verdicts on entire communities." Darius stepped closer to Morrow, his gaze cutting through the last of his defenses. "Judge Morrow, can you look into the eyes of those sitting here, those who have suffered from the injustice of your rulings, and honestly say that you didn't know what was happening in your courtroom?" Morrow pressed his lips together, his hand trembling as he reached for his pen. I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes avoiding the truth. "Maybe. I didn't realize." Darius didn't let that weak defense slide. "Didn't realize," he emphasized, his voice now thundering. "You had 30 years to realize, but you did nothing. And because of your silence, hundreds, even thousands, have paid the price." The room seemed to freeze. Every gaze, every breath was fixed on Morrow. A committee member, her voice firm and stern, broke the silence. "Judge Morrow, do you deny that your rulings have been biased?" For the first time, Morrow didn't answer immediately. He bowed his head as if the weight of that question was too much to bear. I was wrong," he whispered, his words barely audible. But each word rang out in the room like an irreversible confession. Darius stood tall, his eyes burning with resolve. "You were wrong," he repeated, his voice slow but heavy with impact. "And your mistake is not just the mistake of an individual. It is a sign of a system that needs to be changed. You owe more than just an apology. You owe justice, the very justice you've denied so many." The room erupted in hushed murmurs as if everyone had been allowed to breathe after a long period of silence. Yet, within those murmurs there was a clear stirring of anger and determination. Darius took another step forward, his presence overtaking the space in the hearing room. His eyes locked onto Morrow's, never wavering for a second. He held up the thick file, raising it high so that the entire room could see. "You say these were unintentional mistakes?" Darius repeated, his voice sharp and echoing. "Then look at what we have here." He opened the file, each page turning with a sharp, cold sound in the still air. "This is a list of cases over the last 10 years. Every single one shows one thing. White defendants always receive the leniency that black defendants never get." Darius paused, his eyes challenging every justification Morrow could muster. "Do you truly believe all this bias is just coincidence? That it doesn't reflect a clear pattern, a system that you have helped uphold?" Morrow began to waver, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that the unease was growing in him, his facade cracking under the weight of the truth. The eyes from the crowd felt like arrows, forcing him to confront the reality he had long ignored. A committee member, an older woman with a sharp voice, broke the silence again. "Judge Morrow, do you deny that your rulings have led to systemic injustice? We want a clear answer." Morrow swallowed hard, his head lowering as if the weight of the question was crushing him. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Finally, a hoarse voice emerged, barely audible. I didn't mean to. Maybe. I didn't realize." The room held its breath. The audience, the committee members, and even the witnesses all fell into absolute silence, waiting for the next move. Morrow's faint admission seemed like the bell tolling the fall of an icon of authority. Darius didn't stop there. He took another step forward, his voice slow but heavy, each word etched into the air. "You say you didn't mean to, but these mistakes have happened over and over for 30 years. These mistakes are not accidental. They are the result of a prejudice that has been ingrained in how you see justice." Darius pointed to the documents on the table, his eyes piercing through Morrow. "Your mistakes aren't just numbers on a chart," he said. "They are families torn apart, opportunities stolen, and people pushed into the shadows just because they look different from you. You didn't just make mistakes. You hurt a community, a generation." A murmur of whispers rose from the crowd. Those who had suffered injustice exchanged glances, the fury in their eyes flaring like flames. Ellie Sherman, seated in the witness box, bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. It was a release, years of silence finally spilling out. Judge Florence Hatcher, who had remained silent for years, nodded slowly, her face showing relief tinged with regret. She knew that this moment wasn't just about Morrow. It was about the years she allowed things to go on without speaking up. Darius turned back to face the committee, his voice booming like a thunderclap. "Today, we are not just looking at the mistakes of an individual. We are examining how this legal system has failed to protect the vulnerable. Judge Morrow doesn't just owe an apology to those who've suffered injustice. He owes them justice." Applause erupted from the crowd, not in celebration but in relief and hope. For the first time, the light of justice shone in this room, dispelling the darkness of abused power. Darius stood tall, his gaze never leaving Morrow's, ensuring that the man could no longer evade responsibility. And in that moment, everyone understood. Nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Just days after the public hearing, an official announcement from the Magnolia City Court's office was released. Judge Irving Morrow had submitted his resignation. The statement provided no detailed explanation, but everyone knew the reason. A judge who had once been seen as a symbol of authority was now forced to step down because he could no longer defend his own decisions. Darius received the news while at his office. He neither celebrated nor felt comfortable. To him, Morrow's resignation was just the first step. His resignation doesn't fix the wrongs this system has caused. He muttered to himself, "We need real change." Following Morrow's departure, a series of reforms were implemented at the Magnolia Courthouse. Under pressure from public opinion and human rights organizations, the court leadership pledged to adopt new measures to ensure fairness. One of the most significant changes was the appointment of Ellie Sherman as the court's new oversight officer. With her experience and proven courage, Ellie took the helm of an independent committee tasked with reviewing and monitoring all court decisions to prevent any future bias. Ellie stood before the court staff at her swearing-in ceremony, her voice trembling but resolute. "I once thought silence was the only way to survive, but now I understand that silence doesn't change anything. Justice can't truly exist if we don't fight for it every day." Additionally, a mandatory ongoing training program on bias awareness and fairness was implemented, requiring all judges and court staff to participate. The court system was also digitized, allowing data on cases and judge decisions to be publicly accessible for everyone to monitor. While the court underwent internal reforms, the Magnolia community was not passive. Rosa Hart, the elderly woman who had witnessed Darius's case in the courtroom, organized a community meeting at her small church. It wasn't just a gathering to thank Darius, but a call to action. "We've seen what happens when one person dares to stand up," Rosa said before the crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. "But Darius couldn't do it alone. We must become the voices to stop injustice from continuing. This is our time to unite." The meeting drew hundreds of residents, from those who had suffered injustice to young people hungry for change. Darius was there too, quietly standing in the back. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but when Rosa invited him to speak, he couldn't decline. "What we've achieved isn't just my victory," Darius said, his voice warm and sincere. "It's the victory of all of us, those who dared to speak up and refused to accept injustice. But remember, this is just the beginning. Justice is a long journey, and we must walk it together." As the meeting came to a close, Darius stood outside the church, witnessing the change in the eyes of those around him. It wasn't just hope, it was resolve. Magnolia was no longer a place that silently accepted injustice. He felt relief, but also recognized the greater responsibility now weighing on his shoulders. Ellie stepped out, offering him a gentle smile as she saw him. "You've done what I once thought was impossible," she said. "We did it together," Darius replied, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And we will keep going." From that moment on, the Magnolia Court not only changed in terms of policy but also in spirit. Those who had worked under Morrow's rule now felt freer to carry out their responsibilities with fairness. Cases were handled with more care, and the people of the city began to feel that their voices were being heard. The image of Darius, Rosa, and Ellie became a symbol of the power of unity between the community and the justice system. Magnolia was no longer a place where biased decisions were made in silence. It had become a beacon of hope and justice. Darius knew that the journey ahead was still long, but he believed that Magnolia had taken the right first step. He thought to himself, "Not just for us, but for future generations." Magnolia had changed, but the echoes of the struggle reached far beyond the limits of a small town. The name Darius Carter began to appear in news articles, legal bulletins, and forums. What he had done was not just a victory in Magnolia. It became a powerful reminder that true justice requires the courage to confront deeply hidden injustices. One morning, while working in his office, Darius received an email from a professor at a prestigious law school. "We would like to invite you to teach a special course on professional ethics and fairness in the legal system," the email read. The professor described how the school was looking for someone who could bring a practical perspective and inspiration to the next generation of young lawyers. Darius read the letter over and over, a mixture of surprise and pride filling him. He agreed. In the months that followed, Darius began teaching at law schools across the country. He shared his story, but not just the successes. He also spoke of the struggles, the loneliness, and the moments when he had to face his fears. "Professional ethics is not a distant concept," he said during one lecture. "It is something you will fight for every day, even if it costs you dearly." One late evening, while checking his email, Darius discovered a short but emotional letter from a young law student in another state. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Carter, I am a second-year student at the University of Texas Law School. I once felt lost and doubted whether I could make a difference in the legal field. But after reading about your story, I realized why I chose this path. You made me believe that the law is not just rules. It is how we protect people and what is right. Thank you for standing up when others didn't." Darius sat quietly, his eyes momentarily filled with emotion. The letter reminded him that all the sacrifices, all the hardships, were worth it. In his modest office, Darius hung a special frame on the wall. Inside was the $750 fine receipt that Judge Morrow had imposed on him that day. For others, it might have been a worthless piece of paper, but for Darius, it was a symbol of a beginning, a reminder that any injustice, no matter how small or large, must always be confronted with courage. Beneath the receipt, he wrote a simple message by hand. Justice does not come from silence. Darius did not just teach the law, he told stories. In every lecture, he painted a picture of the legal system. Not just the dry clauses and textbooks, but a living system that directly impacts people and communities. He shared his experiences, from facing Judge Irving Morrow to the sleepless nights spent analyzing data, and the feeling of victory when justice was served. His stories were not just meant to impart knowledge. They were reminders to his students that the law is the most powerful tool to change the world, but it only matters when used correctly. One morning, after a lecture on professional ethics and personal responsibility, a young student approached the podium. His eyes shone with admiration and determination. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice full of emotion, "I used to think that the law was just a tool for building a career, but your story has changed the way I see it. You've made me understand that the legal profession is not just a job. It's a mission to protect those who have no voice. Thank you for helping me rediscover why I chose this path." Darius smiled, shaking the student's hand. "Thank you," he replied warmly. "Always remember, every time you stand up for the truth, you're not just helping one person, you're building a better future for the entire community." Darius's teachings went beyond the classroom. They spread outward, igniting a sense of responsibility in each individual. Students began organizing discussions about fairness and bias in the legal system, researching local cases to uncover hidden injustices. One group of students at the law school where Darius taught even formed a civil club, offering free legal support to those who couldn't afford an attorney. One female student, Clara, had once shared with Darius that she had hesitated to become a lawyer. "I always thought the system was too big and too complicated to change," Clara said. "But your story made me realize that everyone has their own power. I don't need to change everything, I just need to change one life at a time." Clara not only graduated with honors, but also went on to become a human rights lawyer, helping victims of domestic violence. What she did was a living testament to the impact Darius had planted. Darius realized that his journey did not end in Magnolia, or just within the walls of lecture halls. A letter from a law student in a different state, where he had never taught, moved him deeply. The writer explained that after reading Darius's story, they had initiated an investigation at their local courthouse and uncovered a series of similar unjust trials. "I once felt powerless before the system's authority," the letter said, "but you showed me that the truth always has a way of speaking out, if we are brave enough to stand up." The movement was no longer just about Darius or Magnolia. It had become a call to action, urging transparency and accountability within the entire legal system across the country. Judges, lawyers, and communities began to pay closer attention to statistical data and to how legal decisions affected the vulnerable. Darius's story was mentioned at national legal workshops, in fairness courses, and even in community forums. In his office, Darius hung a simple but meaningful frame. Inside was the $750 fine receipt that Judge Morrow had once imposed on him. To outsiders, it might have been a small memento, but for Darius it was a symbol of the beginning of a journey. Below the receipt he wrote by hand, "Justice is never free, but it is worth more than any cost." That receipt not only reminded Darius of his steadfastness during difficult times, but also inspired young people who visited his office. One student once asked, "Do you hang it there to remind people of the injustice?" "No," Darius replied, smiling. "I hang it to remind people that injustice can always be challenged, and sometimes even the smallest action can change an entire system." Darius's story not only inspired, it also sowed faith in a brighter future. The students he taught and the communities he reached all became beacons carrying the light of justice forward. Darius knew that his journey wasn't over. He had only just begun. But he also knew that, along with passionate young people and communities no longer afraid, they could build a more just legal system for everyone. "We don't need one hero," Darius often said. "We need thousands of people ready to stand up, each doing their part and no one stopping." And that, he knew, was the true power to change the world. On a sunny day, hundreds of people gathered in front of the newly built building in the heart of Magnolia. The building held special significance. It was the first Justice Ethics Center in the state, where training sessions, workshops, and studies on fairness in the legal system would be held. The center's name, Magnolia Justice Center, was engraved on a shiny brass plaque hanging at the main entrance, symbolizing the change that had begun there. Darius Carter, who was invited to be the keynote speaker for the inauguration ceremony, stood on a small stage, simply but solemnly decorated. He wore a black suit with a small pin that read, "Justice for All." Darius stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were some familiar faces. Ellie Sherman, smiling proudly, Rosa Hart, always the strong voice of the community, and Nina Alvarez, the young law student, sitting beside Rosa with bright eyes. The two of them, one a symbol of the older generation, the other a symbol of the future, sat together, embodying the spirit of unity that had connected the entire city. Darius took a deep breath, then began. "We are here today to mark a turning point in the long journey toward justice and fairness. This center is not just a building. It is a commitment that everyone, no matter where they come from, deserves to be treated fairly under the law." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the attentive faces. Not long ago, Magnolia was a place where many felt fear when stepping into a courtroom. But today, we prove that change is possible. Not because of one person, but because of all of us. Those who refuse to accept injustice, those who dared to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." The applause rang out, but Darius was not finished. He lowered his head, his voice growing deeper but filled with emotion. But we must not forget that this journey is far from over. Justice is not a destination. It is a path, and we must walk that path every day with courage and resolve. When the speech ended, the applause echoed throughout the space. But among the faces in the crowd, Darius noticed a familiar figure standing silently in the back. Irving Morrow, once a symbol of oppression in the Magnolia legal system, stood quietly, dressed in a gray coat, holding a hat, his eyes focused on the stage. Morrow said nothing, but his gaze held something Darius had never seen before: regret. Perhaps it was regret for his own mistakes, or for not realizing sooner that the power he once wielded had been abused. Darius gave a slight nod in Morrow's direction, without needing any words. Morrow's presence wasn't a complete redemption, but it was a beginning. After the ceremony, Darius descended from the stage. He shook hands with everyone, from old friends to young students just beginning their journey. Rosa Hart approached, taking his hand, her voice filled with emotion. "We've come a long way, Darius, but I believe that with people like you, the future will be brighter." Just after that, Nina Alvarez came forward, beaming with a radiant smile. "Mr. Carter, thank you for everything. You not only showed us what justice is, but you also showed us that we can change the system from within." Darius smiled at the two women, two different generations, but sharing the same passion. "I'm just the first to open the door," he said. "It's all of you who keep it open." That afternoon, as everyone had left, Darius stood quietly in front of the center building, his gaze lifting to the Magnolia Justice Center sign. A gentle breeze blew, as if carrying the voices of the past, the voices of those who had been forgotten, now finally heard. He thought to himself, justice is not something that comes naturally. It must be built, protected, and passed on to the next generation. And as he turned to walk away, he knew that this journey was not over. It had only just begun. Magnolia had changed, but the world beyond still held many injustices that needed to be challenged. With faith and hope in his heart, Darius continued to move forward, ready to face any challenge ahead. He knew that the flame he and the Magnolia community had ignited would never die out. Darius Carter's journey was a living testament that, with courage and determination, we can challenge injustice and change an entire system. But the question remains, if you were in Darius's shoes, would you have the courage to stand up for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to never miss the next inspiring content. Justice always needs more companions, and we hope you'll be a part of it. Thank you for watching.